Daryl's shaking his head. You don't agree? It's the same amount of hours, right? Every day. Some days we feel like we've got shorted on hours, but in reality, guess what? We've all got the same amount. Proverbs chapter 9. Everyone doing well this week? We went through a rainy spring. Spring's over. Now 90s. Next several days or next week I saw. I don't know what to believe. Just take it as it comes, right? Talked to a guy today, and he's looking at over 100 where he's at. I said, I'll take what we've got. Is it? I'm worried we're headed south. It's never cooler south. So anyway, it is what it is, right? Knowledge, but then I thought, well, a fool rejects instruction, a fool rejects wisdom. And all three of those are right? Knowledge, instruction, wisdom. And you look at this in these verses. He who corrects a scoffer gets shame for himself. What's a scoffer? Silence. What's the progression here? That's it. That's what it is. That's one of the definitions is a mocker from this word, a mocker. And so when you try to help this individual by imparting wisdom, what do? Sarcasm, make fun.
Pessimistic,
Yeah.
not a good attitude.
Yeah. And so we might say they blow you off, right? Brush you off. Like, oh, I can't believe you would tell me something like that, right? And so here, we see he who corrects a scoffer gets shame for himself. Proverbs 26 and verse 4 is one of the first verses I thought of when I think about this. Proverbs 26 and verse 4. He said, do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. And so, and the verse goes on, or the section goes on. We haven't studied our way into this section this far along. But again, we think about that person who's just going to make fun of you for giving them a recommendation, right? Say, hey, have you ever thought of? And I thought about Noah and the flood. Because how many people were on the ark? 8, right? Noah spent his lifetime, Peter wrote, telling us that he was a preacher of righteousness. How many people brushed Noah off? All but 8. Right? The whole world brushed him off. Do you think anybody mocked him? I think so. You know, there's a lot of things about the account we don't know. But we know that only 8 people made it on the ark. And as we think about this, wisdom equals salvation. So we know who was inside the ark. Wisdom, the wise. Who was on the outside? The people that fall into this classification, right? Those who rejected the wisdom of Noah. Who did he get his wisdom from? God. And his message that he was preaching was wisdom from God. We talked about that last week in 1 Corinthians 1 about that preaching the cross or preaching Christ equals what? Wisdom. Okay? So we see that. And he who rebukes a wicked man only does what? Harms who? Himself. Why? Because what's that scoffer or that mocker, as Holly brought up that word, which is one of the definitions when I looked it up, that's correct. A mocker, what are they going to do to you?
They're going to turn on you and start saying stuff about you that's not true.
That's right. And so, you know, we've got to learn when to what? Walk away. Didn't Jesus command his apostles in some situations to shake the dust off their feet? And there's situations, right? There's some situations where I say, boy, I wish I would have stepped up and said something. And then there's other situations I said I shouldn't have said something, right? And wisdom is knowing the difference between the two.
It's important to know who you are too in that wisdom. You know what you're doing, and you know what you're doing is right, so you don't have to say anything. You can just move on.
know, we've met men, women that answer almost every question with a Bible verse. It's hard to be wrong, isn't it? I think about Garland Elkins. He's passed away several years ago. He always had a Bible verse. You know, even if it was, I hate to say he twisted it, you know, but a funny, right, in relation to things. He always had that on his mind. What was that? Wisdom. Okay? And so we come to verse 8. He said, do not correct a scoffer lest he hates you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will do what? Love you, right? You had something?
I was interested. I looked at that word corrects. It could be either with words, you know, like trying to shame them or whatever, but it also could mean to go to blows, like fight.
To fight with them, to argue with them.
So it's kind of interesting because it could, I mean, both ways it's going to bring you shame.
But to argue with them about it.
Yeah. So, or to, you know, get mad and punch him. All
Or
it's
to
going
punch
to do
him,
is just cause
'cause-
you to get shamed
Yeah.
because he's a scoffer.
Yeah. We were talking about that on the deck just before, right? Not that we're getting ready to fight somebody, but we're talking about an irritating situation, right? Irritate. So you got to go away. Get out of that. But rebuke a wise man, he will love you. Noah Olson at Bible Camp, I think I mentioned this already. He talked about 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? A wise man is going to sit down and do what? Yeah, the thing about, as we started this study, you have King Solomon, the first time we see his wisdom on display. He had 2 women that came into him. And what was the first thing he did? He listened to them, and then he shared his wisdom. Okay. One did what with his wisdom? She understood where he was coming from. And the other one didn't care. I think we see the contrast of the two that we're talking about in these verses in that situation. And by Solomon's wisdom and the way that they responded, what did he find out? The truth. The truth. Okay. And so in that situation, there was one that rejected his and one that accepted. And the truth was found through that. Verse 9, give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still what? Wiser. Right? He takes that. Teach a just man, and who he will increase in learning. Right? And again, we're not talking about worldly wisdom. What are we talking about? Godly wisdom. We see that. Any questions or more comments about this section of scriptures? If not, we'll move on to verses 10 through 12. Did I miss anybody? Okay. Fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For by me, your days will be multiplied, and years of life will be added to you. If you are wise, and are wise for yourself, and if you scoff, you will bear it alone. Okay? And again, as I've talked about last week, chapter 9 is a transition to the next section. And so, up until chapter 9, we've seen a lot of listen to my instruction, my son, right? Listen to my instruction. Now we're starting to get into the Proverbs. They're still a little bit longer, but as we're talking about a short, pithy sentence or statement. And so the fear of the Lord is what? The beginning of wisdom. Okay. What's another word for fear? Reverence. What did you say? Terror. That's a different type of fear, but that would be, we're talking about reverence, right? At some point in our lives, most of the time, the instruction that our parents gave us, we start to realize, hey, that might not be so bad after all, right? And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about when we reverence or honor God's instruction or wise instruction, then we see this is the beginning of what? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We start to respect God. We start to gain wisdom. Think about this. The plan of salvation, we mentioned this last week, and I've been thinking about this in relation to the book of Proverbs as we talk about this, the righteousness versus unrighteousness, godliness versus ungodliness, wisdom versus foolishness. So you have hearing the gospel, right? What's hearing the gospel? You start to either study it for yourself, someone starts to study it with you, you're reading, you're starting to understand. Here, what's the next step? Believe. Don't be scared, you all know, right? Shout it out. Hear, believe. When we look at this verse, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What step in the plan of salvation? I already gave it away. What step are we talking about? The believing. When we start believing the things that are being said, well, who's the gospel come from? Who's the message come from? From God. When we start to believe the Bible, it's because we're starting to respect what God says, because of His authority, His reverence. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. When someone starts to study the plan of salvation, the wisdom is starting, right? It's starting to grow within them. It says, and the knowledge of the Holy One is what? Understanding. Can we have true wisdom without knowledge of God? No. We have worldly wisdom. We can't have true wisdom until we start to understand who God was. I heard a preacher one time in a conversation. He said that he believed that the best place to find about the character of God in the book of Exodus. And I never thought about it. Well, there's a lot we learn about the character of God from the book of Exodus. And so we see the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Who are we trying to learn about? You know, we talk about Noah tonight. We talk about Abraham. We talk about Esther, Job. We can go on and on about all these people that we know about. And we teach Bible stories or accounts about, right? Because these are historical events that happen. But all those events and all those people are leading to who? The Holy One, Christ. Christ came to declare who? The Father. So we see that. Okay, wisdom. Verse 11, for by me your days will be multiplied. What was one of the promises given to Solomon? God says, I'm going to grant you a request. What's your request? What do you ask for? Solomon said, I want wisdom. Give me wisdom so that I can guide this great people. Who's God's people? And because of that, God says, I'll also give you what? What's that? That was one of the ones that had a stipulation on it. So he said, I'm going to give you wisdom because that's what you requested. He said, I'm going to give you fame. I'm going to give you wealth. And if you're faithful, I'll give you what? Long life. Okay? We look at this. It says, for by me your days will be multiplied, and the years of life will be added to you. Okay? How old does God promise that we're going to live to be? We know every day is a blessing, isn't it? Through eternity, absolutely. Our days will be multiplied. I didn't even think about it from the eternal aspect. That's a good. And so, Solomon didn't live as long as his father David. I have to go back and double check, but I'm sure that's the case. Why is that? God says, I'll prolong your days. Was Solomon known for his righteousness later on in life? No. He had a period of unfaithfulness, didn't he? We asked the question, how long would Solomon have lived if he's righteous? I don't know. But I'll tell you, I believe he would have lived longer. Then we asked the question, and so Lauren brought up a good point about our eternal. Our days will be prolonged, won't they, into eternity. When we think about our life here, are we going to live longer because of our righteousness? We don't know how much time God gave us. Right? Is God prolonging our time because of our righteousness? We don't know. But we see that there's no better life or no more blessed life than we can have than the righteous life. And years of life will be added to you, verse 11. And we're talking about with Solomon. So verse 12, he says, if you're wise, you are wise for yourself. If you scoff, you will bear it. What? Okay. Over time, I've thought about Saul. Was Saul a lonely man? I'm not talking about the apostle Paul, Saul, but Saul the king. Have you ever thought about him as being a lonely man? I've thought about him as being a lonely man. He was surrounded by people all the time, but I believe he lived a very lonely life because of his attitude and the way he was. He was surrounded by people, but I think he was alone. I think he lived a sad life. And when we are the scoffer, the fool, reject wisdom, what type of life are we going to have? A lonely life. All right, any questions or comments about this?
That also means that you'll be the first to suffer.
The first to
Because it
suffer.
says you will bear it. So he has to be suffering from something,
Yeah, you'll bear it alone.
but he has to do it alone.
You'll bear it. Here's the thing. You know the Back to the Future movies? Those aren't real. But anyway, but there's some principles that are interesting from those movies, and I'm not condoning everything in the movies. But in one of the movies, I remember, and maybe all of them, but he had to be careful because the history of him was starting to be erased, right? And so because he was able to go back in time and see his parents when they're high schoolers and they're meeting, if he changed things and they didn't meet, then he would never be born. And here's the thing. What would your life be without God? We have some ideas, right? But the only life that I know is what life? The life that I lived. You know, sometimes we go back and we say, what if I would have made this decision or that decision differently? We don't know. The only life that we know is what? This life. Okay? And so, with that in this section, you know, talking about the promise, the multiplying of your years, how long would we have lived if we weren't faithful or weren't God? Don't know. And then we think about verse 12, what Kathy brought up, talking about bearing the struggles. We're talking about struggles, difficulties, burdens in life. How many of us have burdens? Nobody? Well, that's great. We all raise our hand. What burdens would we have if we weren't Christians?
I don't know how people in the world can make it sometimes.
That's a great attitude to have.
Seriously, because I know I can't speak for anybody else, but for myself, God has put limits on your life. Being a Christian, you have limitations, things you can and can't do, and I'm glad for them, because otherwise, people just be out here willy-nilly just living however.
But God's also given you a hedge to protect you.
I don't know.
And
I
so,
don't know how people do it.
a life's hard. Why make it harder?
Right.
Yeah. No. You know, you talk to. I think all of us have talked to somebody or known somebody, and you wonder how they have any get up for tomorrow, because they don't believe in something after this life. Their life is a mess. They've got nothing. And we can't condone suicidal thoughts or things like that. But you can see when you get to the end of your rope, in a sense, and there's nothing at the end to look forward to. There is, but they don't know, and they rejected it. I think that you could comprehend how that could be a viable option. Not that it's right. That's why we need to be there to help and teach and educate. But I think there's some people, based on their perspective, you say, I could understand how you might make that decision. You had a
Can you
comment.
explain hedges more? I mean, I understand the principle.
Hedges?
Just in general, like,
Yeah.
maybe a little more detailed. I'm not trying to interrupt, but it's interesting.
Nope. This is, go to Job.
Yeah, I know he had one, but
And so,
how do we get them?
how do we get them? God gives them to us.
Do you have one?
Because God gives his people a hedge. So, we're introduced to Job in Job chapter 1. And the first 5 verses, we understand about the blessings that Job had. Job wasn't a poor man. He was well off. He had a lot of physical blessings. Is there anything wrong with that? No. Did they detract from his righteousness? He didn't allow them to. For some people they would have, but not for Job. So then you come to verse 6, Job 1 and verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and from the earth and from walking back and forth on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Verse 10, this is where we're headed. "Have you not made a hedge around him?" What's a hedge? We've got hedge rows. Yeah, you think about people plant hedgerows. Here, they tried the living hedge with multiflora rows, and then we have hedge trees. What does anybody know what a hedge tree actually is? Actually, an Osage orange. But because we grew them in hedges, guess what we called them? A hedge tree. And then we cut hedge posts, but they're actually Osage orange. What's that? It slow you down. And so the hedge, you think about hedges, they're a living fence. And a lot of hedge bushes are thorny and prickly, and they're thick and they're hard to get through. And in some places, they grow hedges, and they take the limbs and constantly are weaving them together. And I believe it was in Germany, the hedgerows were so old and so thick and so strong that the tanks couldn't go through them during the wars. So you think about that. They couldn't get through. And so instead of fences, some places have hedgerows.
Pretty good protection.
Yeah, pretty good protection. And so here Satan says to God, "Haven't you made a hedge, or have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land." I think we have some description of a hedge here. He says that it's protecting what? What's protected by that hedge?
Everything he has in his family.
Yeah, everything he has in his family. And then God says also, what? Or Satan says that you have also blessed what? Bless the work of your hands. That's an important principle. Did Job get what he had through nothing? What did he get it through? I saw a little meme or something, and it was the book to success, right? And you open it up, guess what it says? Work. That was it. Work. That's something that we need to hand out in America. Maybe put hard work, because people don't know. They think work anyway. But he says he blessed the work of your hands, and the possessions have increased in the land as a result of what? Now here, think about this. If God puts a hedge around his faithful, here's the thing. Who saw the hedge? Satan. Right? Is this some mystical hedge that no one can see?
The most important person to see it, Satan.
Now Satan could see it. It's not something we're going to plant in our yard that people, when they drive by, say, "Hey, look, there's a hedge of God protecting that guy." But here's the question. Satan saw the hedge. He knew that Job was protected. He called it a hedge. Right? Should the world be able to see the hedge?
See, the blood of Christ covers us.
I think they should. I think they should. God uses places, peoples, times for opportunities. God used Job in this place at this time for what? For the world to see. Satan knew. I think that people on the outside should be able to see the hedge. Was there anybody else that we ever read about that had a hedge of protection that we know about? Jonah. God used him.
Dead.
And
Probably David. Yeah.
There's three people that gets aliens.
Well, David in the lion's den.
go to, I think it's Acts 18. I'm checking my verse here. This is off the cuff. Yep, Acts 18. Do you have something?
Well, I was wondering what kind of hedge you're talking about. Is it physical?
No, I'm talking about just God watches over his children and protects them.
Because you
Blesses
think
them.
about the first century Christians and Stephen, they lost everything. They lost their lives. So it's not it can't be a physical protection because where they didn't have a hedge then.
Well, Job lost everything. God lowered let Satan in.
Yeah.
And so we'll go back there. In Acts 18, then Paul was on his missionary journeys. And so we see in verse 9, the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision and said, do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent, for God says what? I'm with you, and what?
No man shall set on you.
Okay. And then what's God say? Why do you need to be here, Paul? The end of verse 10. So for I have.
Much people.
Yeah. So God told told Paul specifically. He said, I'm going to protect you. No one's going to hurt you. And if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and you look at verse 3, when Paul's writing to Corinth, what we read about in Acts 18 is when Paul did not want to go to Corinth, but God told Paul, go to Corinth because it's going to be okay. But look at Paul's, when he came, he says, I was with you in weakness, in fear, and what? Surely. God had to tell him in the book of Acts, he said, go ahead and go into the city. I'm going to protect you. I think this is a second place in the Bible where we see that God gave one of his people a specific protection. Are there other situations? I think so.
But there's several places in the Bible that talks about God's favor being, favor of God.
But this is the thing I struggle with, Justin, for myself is, we look at how Job's life was with God, and then we see God allowing that hedge to be lowered. But then it comes back up, right? After Job proved himself. But I wonder, what would Job's life have been like without a hedge?
That also rains on the righteous and the unrighteous.
Yeah.
That's something to consider here, but I don't know how to consider.
Yeah. And so just because we have a hedge doesn't mean we won't go through difficult times. But we see that God set the limits for Satan. We didn't keep reading. We're out of time. We didn't keep reading the first two chapters of Job. But Satan had limits, right? God says, you can only go this far. You can only go this far. That's it. And so we asked, even though Satan says, I can't get to Job at all because of this hedge. But then God says, I'm going to allow you to do this up to a certain point. And then at the end of all that, all the trials, when Job showed himself faithful, what did he do? What did God do?
Life flourished. Hedges back on.
Yeah, he doubled in increase. Now, does that mean, like Eric brought up the point, did Christians die in the first century? Yeah. But here's the thing. Is our hedge always physical? Even if we die, what do we have? What's Paul say in 2 Corinthians? For we know that if the earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have what? We have something better to look forward to. Okay. You had something?
Well, when I think of a hedge, the only physical, or the only hedge that I think about is John chapter 10, where Jesus said, once you're in my Father's hand, no one can pluck you out. That's a protection that no one can take my soul from that. But there's no, because you have several Christians who were dying for the cause of Christ, who were living faithful. They lost their homes, their things. You know, the Old Testament with Job and stuff, everything, their rewards were physical, very physical, which is different with the New Testament. So when I think of a hedge,
Well,
I
also,
think of John 10.
I think about God's providential protection. So when I think about the hedge of Job, I also wonder about Joseph. What did Joseph get when he went to Egypt? God used him, and he protected him all along the way. I also wonder about Daniel, right? I think that under other circumstances, some of the requests that Daniel would have made, he would have died. But God gave him a hedge of protection. Anyway, any questions or comments? We're out of time. All right, thank you.